What's up, guys? Jesse here. In today's session, we're going to talk about enterprise companies, specifically how to serve them well. And one thing we've learned is that working with enterprise companies or larger companies in general is more about just the design or development deliverable. It turns into, what you do around that design and development deliverable. It really makes the difference in the long run. So let's jump into it. Today, I'm really excited to share some super practical content. I hope it's very practical for you guys. At Finsweet, we have had the privilege to work with a lot of enterprise clients who are, large companies that are doing a lot of things. And I think the word enterprise sometimes gets like a Hollywood flair to it. So don't be afraid of that. I think what we should do in this session is just think about enterprise companies as large companies, and we'll kind of dig into that. So we're going to learn about how these large companies work and how you can structure your team, your processes, and your communication to anticipate and meet their needs. So if you want to serve large companies well, you have to first understand how they're structured and how they work. So ask yourself things like, what are their processes? How long do things take on their side? How fast do they need to move? And what are they doing kind of around the project that will be important for your engagement? And then how many stakeholders are involved? You'll see, as you work with a lot of these larger companies, you'll realize there's a lot more at stake than just like the marketing team. Typically, there's a ton of initiatives that are organized around a website push that are going to be important. So this is the type of information that we try to gain and learn to anticipate and plan for. And it influences how we structure our team around our designers and developer. So let's look at how these enterprise companies are structured. When you start to work with these larger companies, you'll realize a few common things. One, that there are many hands involved on the client's team. So they might have a designer or two, a product owner, maybe someone from their engineering team, someone handling A/B testing, and maybe even a producer who's going to keep all of those roles kind of tangled in and corralled on their side, on the client side. Not to mention, all of the team members that you have on your side. So as you're working with these larger companies, you do have to learn how to work well within that structure. Another thing you'll learn is that they typically have a marketing agenda. And the biggest impact that this is going to have is timeline. A lot of times when we're working with a larger company, we'll see that they have some sort of either press release or maybe it's something else, a marketing campaign, email campaign that's going to be geared towards or scheduled around the launch of a page or even a whole website that you're working on. An additional thing, a common trait with these larger companies is that there are typically many stakeholders, like we said, and they're watching the success of the project. So this does tend to increase the pressure around the project. But if you're prepared with some of the things that we're going to talk about, that does alleviate the pressure. And then finally, these larger companies, they have processes that often force them into a kind of hurry up, then wait cadence. And what do I mean by this? It's in many cases, it's going to be a rush to maybe get the contract together, and then procurement and approval takes a long time. But then once that's done on their side, they're going to come back to you quickly to be able to move through the design development, whatever the deliverable that you're actually handing off to them. They're going to want to move through that pretty quickly so that they can, again, meet their deadline. But there's a lot of kind of back and forth with that hurry up and wait. So this does bring us back to the opening statement, which is that supporting enterprise companies or larger companies is about more than just the deliverable. It's also about the supporting team around the deliverable. So in our experience, this is the team that we have learned to add around the deliverable. So of course, you've got your designers and developers. These guys are going to handle the core deliverable. It could be, a brand guideline or a website design or a fully functioning web project that you've built out. That's, what everyone's used to. These are the designers and developers. Then we have our project manager, and we're typically going to have kind of one, but maybe even two, depending on the size of the project. If it's going to be a longer engagement, we might add two project managers just to kind of alleviate some of that communication need. These guys, project managers, are going to support the designers and the developers with communication. And then they're going to be anticipating client needs and ensuring that the deliverable, which the designers and developers are working on, is completed in time. So they're kind of there to manage the hiccups and overall project. And then the final person that we've added on most of our larger projects is an account manager. So where this typically comes in is when you need someone to oversee kind of at an account level. And this gets especially important when you start to work with companies who you'll have multiple projects with, and maybe even projects within different departments. So you might have, one department that's working on an initiative for a specific product, and you have a project with them. And then maybe you have like the main.com that you're building a microsite for or something. So having an account manager really helps to have one person as a kind of a main point of contact for the company when they're looking to start up new initiatives, or they just need help at an account level. And really their goal as an account manager is to say, is this client happy in their relationship with us, with Finsweet overall, and kind of manage that over time. So those are kind of the roles, and then we'll get into some processes here. So we're going to start with the sales cycle, but let's walk through the typical life cycle of a project with a client to see where some of these things are going to come into play, some of these processes, and some of these roles. And I want to lead with a disclaimer that I'm not really going to touch on client acquisition here. So I think there's a ton of approaches to marketing. There are many approaches to establishing brand authority and attracting larger companies. I won't dive into that in this session, but I do want to talk about what we do from our first call with these clients. So I think we've done some other sessions on, how we develop brand authority, whether it be through education or products. And then we've started to do some outbound. So we may have a session in the future on what that looks like from our standpoint. But today, I think we're going to just lean into how are we engaging our client and what are we doing to prepare from that first call with them all the way through the end of a project and beyond. So we'll start with the sales cycle. And the first thing that I want to mention within the sales cycle is kind of a tip or a benefit, and that is technical knowledge. So having technical knowledge on your sales calls is really, really important. I can't tell you how helpful it's been to have this on sales calls. If you know me, my role at the agency at Finsweet is on the sales team. So this is kind of like my world here. And there have been countless calls where it has helped me so much to, pull in my background as a builder, as a creative myself, and be able to use that knowledge on the sales call so that I didn't have to reach out to the other team or other developers on my team to support that sale. So on sales calls, this means that I can, and my other team around me, my other sales team, can answer most of the questions right away without kind of a back and forth internally, and actually articulate how our team, Finsweet, might approach the project from a technical perspective. So what we try to do is we have about 4 people that are taking these sales type calls. And between us, we all try to kind of stay close to and keep a pulse on the industry as a whole, Webflow, its surrounding products. And not only that, but our team's specific skills and abilities. So we're very grateful to have a team with a specific skill set that is unique maybe to other agencies. So we have to keep that in mind, plus understand the capabilities of the products that we're actually using to build these projects. And, there are going to be some cases, of course, when if we get a lead in and we can anticipate that the conversation is going to be maybe a little bit more technical than we feel comfortable with as salespeople. So we would just pull in maybe our CTO or one of the developers that potentially could be on the project to help aid and kind of guide that conversation with the lead. And so what's the benefit of this? When having this knowledge on the initial call speeds up the sales process a ton, because I'm not going to just be fielding questions, going back to my team, getting those questions answered, and then going back to the lead to, potentially even get more questions. What I'm doing is I'm answering the questions right away, and I'm also able to anticipate and maybe speak to some of the things that they might not be thinking about yet if I have some technical knowledge as a base within those conversations. So either I have it myself or I'm pulling in somebody who's going to offer that technical knowledge on these calls. And then another benefit is that this instills tons of confidence in your lead right away that your team is capable of taking on the technical lift that they need. So huge benefit. I would highly encourage you to either learn more as you're on these sales calls with these larger companies, or pull in somebody who can speak to the technical problems and solutions that your clients are looking for. So let's dive into scoping and contracting a little bit here. This is going to be probably most of the content we'll talk about today, because I think you can lay a lot of the groundwork that you need to have success with these larger companies and to be able to serve them well when you're actually scoping out and writing up the contract or the projects that you're going to engage in. So the first thing we're going to look at is emphasize pace and detail. So you should aim to scope the project and get a contract signed as quickly as possible. Because, going back to that kind of hurry up and then wait cadence, we want to get through this process as quickly as possible to give enough padding, enough room for that client to go through all of their internal processes, procurement, legal, whatever it is. And at the same time, we also want to prioritize getting as much detail as possible into the contract. So, pace is important, but also getting a lot of detail into the contract. And this is going to help the client see that you understand the project, but more importantly, will make handoff internally much more efficient, which we'll talk about in a few minutes here. One thing you want to do in your contracts is to detail what your team will do and will not do. This is a fun one, and it can save you a lot, especially when you're considering scope creep, things like that. But the obvious details to include in the contracts are, of course, what your team will do. This is kind of the deliverable that we expect. This is what your client expects. But it's equally as important to detail out what your team is not going to do. And this doesn't just save you from scope creep. It also helps set the client's expectations for the lift that they're going to have to take on when you start the project. So you might write in something as simple as, if we're doing a website project, we will not provide new blog article assets, like the main image. If that's in a gray area at all, just write in, we're not going to include this piece. That, one, saves you from scope creep, the client asking you to do that. And then two, it sets the client's expectation that they are going to have to figure out a resource internally on their side to make sure that gets done. And then, so what's important about this is, or at least one practical thing is, we are going to write this into the contract. And I think just having it, in email is okay, or Slack is okay, but it's even more helpful if you just actually write it into the contract. So the next thing with scoping and contracting is to add buffer time for QA and testing. One lesson that we learned early on was when starting to work with these larger companies is that you need to budget time for this QA and your testing. Many of the projects that you're going to work on with larger clients will have high visibility. And as we've said before, they're going to probably have marketing dollars scheduled to be spent around the launch of the project. And so in order to ease the pressure, you give yourself at least a week, maybe 2 weeks at the end of the project. Or even if you've got a multi-phase project, say you have a design sprint, then a development sprint, and then a testing sprint, something like that, you can add in padded weeks in between those phases to give yourself extra time to make sure things are right. And then also give yourself calendar time if, maybe an extra technical complexity comes up that you didn't anticipate, the client didn't anticipate when you were writing up the contract. You now have extra calendar time that you can use up to fix those issues. So this has saved us a couple times, and it also makes the client feel really comfortable because they know that we have additional time to work with. And I would say if you're hesitant about adding this time in, one thing that we've learned to do is, one, knowing that these larger companies typically do have the budget to pay for this time, but we will sometimes just charge it at halftime for that calendar week, because we know we're not going to be full-time in there, in the project. We might just be there in a supporting role or helping them work through bugs on like a part-time basis during those buffer weeks. So add buffer time in for QA and testing. And then for technically complex projects, you'll want to schedule in a discovery phase. So discovery phases are massively underrated. I think we kind of overlooked them for a while. And these can come in two forms. They can either come in the form of a discovery phase pre-project that you're actually kind of figuring out the scope. You're outlining, this comes into play with web apps in particular really well. You might have a discovery phase where you actually figure out the scope of the project, and then you write the contract for the actual effort separately. And then sometimes, we can understand the scope enough to offer a price and a timeline for the effort, but we know that there's going to be a little bit more detail that we can't necessarily see just yet, but we need to flush it out before we get too far into the project. So what we'll do is we'll just schedule in and we'll budget out a week or two on the front of the project for discovery. And we're not saying like, this is going to turn into a runaway train, or we're going to find something that's going to change the trajectory of the project. We're just essentially communicating with the client that we understand the full scope, making sure both parties are on the same page, and then moving forward with the rest of the project after that week or two. We actually did this with Jack.org, one of our clients, for the Be There certificate. This was a super big WISD and Xano project. One of our first with the tech stack. Really cool project. And we spent the first week, just like I've said, diving in and actually mapping out user flows, communicating back to the client all of the feature sets that are involved. Since this was just a basic one-to-one kind of a re-platform, we already knew the scope, but we wanted to make sure we actually understood and maybe offered areas for improvement to the client right away before we got to, building out everything in Webflow, WISD, and Xano. So super helpful. Definitely utilize a discovery phase when you're working with these larger companies. I think this is also useful with larger projects in general. Another thing to do is to write in surrounding initiatives right into the contract. So as I mentioned earlier, large companies are often going to be planning to spend marketing dollars around the launch of the project. And we've seen campaign launches, we've seen press releases, conferences, and other things scheduled and already paid for in anticipation for the project that you're building for them. In these cases, we try to write the details about those external initiatives right into the timeline of our contract. So an example, maybe we just had a contract recently that I wrote that they asked us to build a new landing page for a product that they're releasing, and they had a press release already scheduled, already booked on the calendar for a specific date. So what I did was I wrote out the actual timeline for our development, and then right under that, I wrote out that the press release for this specific product, which the landing page is for, is actually on X date. And so this does a couple things. So the benefits are it tells the client that we care about the initiatives, And then it also provides additional context to our internal project team when the handoff is made to start the project. So, a lot of these things that we're writing into the contract are definitely to, instill confidence in the client, but a lot of it is going to serve us really well when we're handing off the project from the sales team to the project team, because they're going to have so much stuff and context documented that they don't need to go back and forth with us asking all these questions. They can just read the contract, and then they understand what the context of the project is in completion. So yeah, and then the last thing with scoping and contracting that we'll talk about here is to write what happens after the project into the contract. So detail what happens post-project. When we get the opportunity to work with larger companies, we want to make it as easy as possible for them to work with us again. And this is something that you can do with any client that you have. One thing we want to do is we want to reduce the friction of starting another engagement. We want to keep this relationship going, right? And so in our contract, we always provide the details about how the client can continue work with us after the project launches. And this is the contract, that we're writing, they're signing off before we've even started an effort with them. They're already seeing, okay, after we finish this project, here is how we can continue engaging with Finsweet. So I think this looks different for everyone. For us, this is typically outlining, our service agreement, giving a small blurb about what that is, how it's used. But for you, it might look slightly different. Maybe you have a different way of doing ongoing maintenance, or maybe you can write in, some of your other services that might be beneficial post-launch right into the contract. So these are really, really helpful things. And yeah, just write them into the contract. It's super helpful. So that's scoping and contracting. Let's now look at the project. So we've written up a contract, we've scoped out the effort, and we are getting started with the project. Now we actually get to implement a lot of the things that we've been thinking about and writing down, actually into, take them into place. So the first thing is to use a kickoff call to make a clean handoff. I think, a lot of people are familiar with the kickoff call, and you can do this with any size client. But what we're doing here is really taking a lot of that stuff that we've already established, and we are then making a clean handoff between teams and communicating with the client what we've already established. So there are two pretty clear areas, or timestamps to make a good impression on your client, and those are the start of the project and the launch of the project. And so this kickoff call kind of helps us make a really good impression, even after the sales process has already been completed. We're going to make a really good impression on this client with a clean kickoff call. So here are a couple of things that we do right in that kickoff call. We actually like to mention that we're handing things off from the sales team to the project team. So an example would be, say I just finished out kind of closing a sale process with a client. We just figured out the deal, we wrote the contract, everything is signed, and we are ready to start. So I would actually jump on that kickoff call with the client and with our project team, so project manager and developers, designers maybe. I would jump on that kickoff call, and I would probably do the introductions. I would introduce the team, and then I would say, I'm handing off the project to the project team. So this is really, really helpful. It's a small gesture, but it's helpful because the client now knows, okay, I don't have to go to Jesse anymore. I actually get to go to this project team. So it's either the project manager or the developers who are working on their project, and they have a clear switch handoff from one part of the team to the other. So we're going to introduce the team, and we're actually going to talk about the scope and approach of the project in this call as well. We won't spend a ton of time on this, but we're actually going to walk through it again just really quickly to make sure everyone is kind of hearing it out loud and we're all on the same page. And then we're going to allow some time for questions. This can go both ways. So, Finsweet's developers and product team can ask questions to the client, and then the client can actually ask questions to us. And then we essentially just establish, what's next, and start the project from there. So that kind of bleeds into the next point, which is to communicate and schedule when and how check-ins will be done. So check-ins, this is all about communication, and you want to have consistency and clarity when it comes to communication. So scheduling these check-ins is really key and very helpful. And this is usually done and established on that kickoff call. So you can totally do it on the kickoff call, or you can send this in like a message right after the kickoff call to kind of organize that and get it all scheduled. We tend to have at least one call check-in per week, maybe two if it's a shorter engagement, and then async communication through Slack throughout the week. So there's always going to be regular updates through Slack. And then we have those kind of time-stamped check-in points where everybody can get on a call face-to-face and ask those questions. And one thing to know and be okay with is that the cadence of communication can change as the project progresses. And I'm really saying this from the viewpoint of client to your team perspective. So your cadence should always be the same. You should be always communicating and really trying to over-communicate. But just know that the client may be busier or may not need as much feedback to provide as much feedback during parts of the project. And that's totally okay. But over communication is definitely better than under communication. A rule of thumb when it comes to this is to basically, you'll know if you aren't communicating enough with a client if they feel the need to reach out to you on a regular basis for status updates. You should anticipate, that when they're going to look for updates, and then just go ahead and give them the updates. And that's going to give them tons of confidence, especially with these larger companies. Another thing to do is establish publishing workflows and expectations. With these larger companies, this is going to be really important, and for a number of reasons. One is because you have higher stakes. So every publish is going to see more people. Every page is going to be viewed by more people than if you're looking at a smaller project. And then there's also more people, actually developers or designers actually in the project itself. So it's key to have a good established workflow for publishing. And this has got to be agreed between you and the client. This can be as simple as a dedicated Slack channel or, an approval system within their team, whatever works for you. There's obviously workflows with enterprise hosting that you can take advantage of. You can look into page branching, but whatever you do, you just want to make sure you have a workflow and a process that is established between you and the client that everyone has agreed on and everyone likes. I think this mostly applies to ongoing work, but it's definitely going to be helpful to establish at least early on. And why I say that is, when you're doing ongoing work with a client, they're going to be publishing to the production domain a lot more frequently than if you're just doing like a one-off project. Most of our one-off projects, especially for these larger companies who have, a marketing initiative tied to the project, they're not going to want the project to go live at all until like the day before that event or the day before that campaign. So, this type of thing is definitely conditional here. One thing that we've started to do that's really, really helpful and impactful is actually schedule the launch. So this next point here is to schedule the launch. This is something that we started implementing after a tough project experience, actually. And the reason we do it is to avoid things going live when they shouldn't, and to coordinate well with our clients' external initiatives. So we schedule a launch. And the way we do this is typically as we near the end of the project or a couple weeks out, we'll actually put together a document. It doesn't have to be super official, but it's something that both parties can agree on. And that's going to outline the actual date and time that we're going to launch, and we're going to, we're saying, is the client going to publish? Click publish. Is Finsweet going to click publish? This is the date. This is the time that it's going to go live. And then we've actually started to actually get on a call with those clients during the publish. So we'll get on a call, especially if they're doing it, they'll click go live. And then, we're just there on that call for maybe 30 minutes, maybe an hour to support anything that comes up. And that kind of leads into the next point, which is to stick around for support. This is something that is massively beneficial, especially when working with these larger companies, to just show, that you care about the relationship. So we take 5 business days that we actually just bake into every launch. And we write that into the contract. So, even after that buffer week for QA and testing, we'll have the launch date. And then we have 5 additional business days where our team sticks around for support after launch. And you'll see more times often than not, the client's going to use you during those 5 days. Even if everything went perfectly smooth and, the publish was great, the content looks great, everything's functioning fine, they'll probably still use your team during those 5 business days. So we write that in. It's just baked into every contract. And then we remind them, how we can support them on an ongoing basis. So this kind of goes back to what we wrote into the contract. We're basically just pulling that right back up to the front and reminding them a little bit about how we can support them on an ongoing basis. And this looks different for everyone, like I said. So just make sure to bring up your options for support, whether it be ongoing support or your additional services at this time as you close out the project. So that is the project stage. You've just wrapped up a project and you're feeling good. You have a successful launch under your belt. Now, that's not the end. I think, where you can improve a lot as an agency or as a freelancer is what you do after the project, because you'll realize that with these larger clients, what you want to do is actually establish a relationship with them. And you can think of these projects, as milestones, kind of like dating, going on dates. And so every project is like a date. And hopefully each project or each date should reaffirm how much you like each other. This post-project checklist, or, what happens now, this is really helpful to kind of help reaffirm the relationship. And then you're going to continue to nurture it over time. So one thing you can do is to conduct a postmortem. And this can be with or without the client. I think it's totally up to you. If you want to get more feedback or more candid feedback from the client, you can invite them to the call or even have them fill out, a post-launch form, something like that. But we like to have a call after every project to talk about how it went and what we can learn from it. So this is kind of the important part of the postmortem, is what we can learn from the project, whether it was good or bad. And we use these findings to implement improvements to our processes. So the scheduled launch is actually something that came from one of these postmortems. We had an unfortunately, poor experience with the launch with one of our clients, and we wanted to improve on that and make sure that experience wasn't replicated with another client. So we implemented the scheduled launch, and now we have great launch experiences with all of our clients. And this just came out of a postmortem, which, was probably a 20-30 minute meeting. So really, really valuable, really useful. The next thing you want to do, as we've said, is to educate the client on your other services. I don't think you should be overbearing with this, but it is helpful to have at least some sort of document or a checkpoint where, you're checking in with the client, you're just seeing how they're doing and asking how are their initiatives, how is their year going, that kind of thing. And then maybe you can trickle in some of the other ways that you could support them ongoing with their other initiatives. And then the last thing is to nurture the relationship. And you want to anticipate their needs and keep a pulse on the initiatives. So you'll see the importance as you start to work with these larger clients of establishing, as we've said, and nurturing the relationship with them over time. We've had several clients that we've had for years because we just kept nurturing the relationship really, really well. I actually just wrote up a contract for a client that we've had for probably 4 years, and this will be our second kind of big effort with them. And they probably just came back to us because of the good rapport that we've had on an ongoing basis with them as a client. And one of the things you can do is to anticipate their needs through paying attention to their initiatives. So as you learn more about their client, you'll be able to anticipate more of these needs, and you won't be surprised when, you know, they come to you for a new product launch or to help them with A/B testing or launch a new landing page before press release, something like that. So definitely lean into your clients post-launch, and don't make the project launch be the last point of communication. Make sure you have some check-ins and just kind of keep a pulse on how things are going with them. So closing thoughts. If you want to work with large companies, it's important to understand how they function. And this can include, their pace, what their processes are, who's involved, what other initiatives they have. Understand the external initiatives that your client is planning around the project. So this could be a press release, conference, product launch, etc. Some of the things that we've talked about. And build your internal team to support the level of communication and the speed that these larger companies often require. So having an account manager, having a project manager or two, things like that. And then realize that projects are more than just a design and a development deliverable. You also need a strong team of people around that deliverable. Well, that's it. Thank you so much for joining in today's session. If you want more content like this, if you liked this content, please let us know in the comments, like the video and subscribe, and we'll see you in the next one.